Okay, guys, so in this video, we are going to start talking about perfect squares and perfect cubes and what is so perfect about them. Well, let's take a look. So here I have a table that you should be really familiar with from now on, which is a table of full perfect squares, perfect cubes. And I want you to be aware that when a problem has one of these things that are in the table, something like 25 or 64 or something like that, that is a perfect square. So it's a square of some number. So for example, 36 is square of 6. Why? Because 6 times 6 is 36. So when you have something like that, how do you then factor? These are special formulas that are in front of you. So these formulas will be available on the test, and the question is going to say, this is a perfect square trinomial. But how do you factor it? Okay, so and why is so special? What's so special about these perfect squares? So basically, you can try to factor them the same way that we've done in the past, which is just trial and error. But you're going to see, I think, that using these formulas is going to be slightly easier. But let's take a look at the first example. Okay, so here we have x squared plus 8x plus 16. So what has to happen? So first of all, we need to decide if we're using the first formula or the second. So the difference is that if you have over here a plus, you're also going to have over here a plus. But if you have a minus in between, then you will have a minus over here. But that's really the only difference. So when I'm looking at the sign right here, this is the sign of the x term, right? That one's a positive. So I know I'm going to be using the first formula, right? But how do I know this is a perfect square and how do I factor it? So first of all, when they say factor a perfect square trinomial, what that means is that it's going to be a square. So your answer is going to be a square of something. And what is going to be that something? Well, first of all, instead of the first term, you should think, what is this term a square of? So what can you multiply x squared? I mean, what can you multiply by itself to get x squared? Well, everybody knows that x multiplied by x is x squared. So what is that thing that is multiplied by itself and gives you x squared? Well, that would be x. So here you're going to have x. Then, because this was a plus, you're going to have a plus over here. And then you have to look at this number 16 and ask yourself, okay, square of what is this number? And again, look at this table right here, right? In the table, I see 16 as a perfect square of what number? That would be 4, right? Because 4 squared is 16. Okay, so that tells you that the 4 is going to go right here. And that's it. That's really it. So for this term, you have to ask yourself, okay, square of what is that? That would be x. And for 16, you have to ask yourself, square of what is 16? That's 4. But, okay, so another thing that you have to be aware of, and that's technically, you don't really need to check, but generally speaking, you should be aware that not every trinomial that ends with a perfect square number will factor that way. Another thing has to happen, and that is, which is like a check. Take these two numbers, well, some unknown x and a number 4, double it, so multiply that by 2, so that should be what? 4 times 2, that's 8. That gives you 8x, and that should match this middle term. And so if that doesn't match it, then it's really not a perfect square trinomial, and you couldn't really factor it this way. Okay, so let's look at another example where it's a negative, right? And so for example, let's do one more. So we've got x squared minus 28x plus 196. So how do I know this is a perfect square trinomial? And they will tell you, factor a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so what you're going to do is you're just going to write down parentheses and square it because it has to be a perfect square. Now, because it's x, and I already told you, like, what squared is x squared? Well, that would be x. Another thing that you need to worry about is this sign right here, because that's negative. This right here also is going to be negative at the same time. And then you just have to ask yourself the last question before you finish factoring here is 196. Is what is that squared? Well, that's where you go to this table and you see, okay, where do I see 196? Well, I see it right here. And so this table actually goes all the way to 20, but the 196 is square of what? 14. So that's all you have to do is just say, oh, okay, well, then that's going to be 14. And that's basically it. So the another thing that you should check, just as a side note, you should be able to multiply the x, the 14, and then double it, and that should be equal to the middle term. So this is really 28x. This was negative, so that's also going to be negative. That's good, but you do want to make sure that this middle term is double first times second number over here, and it is. So it's just that means yes, it's a perfect square trinomial. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to look at a couple of more examples of perfect square trinomials.